Will this United States Senate allow a single man to plunge this nation into war when it is our constitutional responsibility to make a decision as to whether to send our men and women? President, we must act. The President has made a decision unilaterally, without consultation of Congress, to start yet another war in the Middle East. It's a reckless decision that is very detrimental to the well-being of our country and very threatening to the Constitution. There's three issues that are absolutely essential to consider by this Congress. First of all, number one, America does not want this war. And I trust the American people. The reason America does not want this war is they have seen it before. They saw it in Iraq, where the justification was weapons of mass destruction. They saw it in Afghanistan, where the justification was getting rid of the Taliban. They saw it in Libya, where the justification was getting rid of Gaddafi. In each case, Saddam, Gaddafi, the Taliban, yes, they were evil people doing bad things. But what was a lie to the American people, and they saw, was that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The Taliban is now back in power after 20 years of war. And the chaos that was sown in Libya lives with us to this day. America understands that it is easy for a president to assert he wants to go to war. He's the commander-in-chief. He can do it, as he has done in this case, by bypassing Congress. But what the American people have seen is that it's easy to start a war, but the consequences and the cost are not avoidable. And they have been very damaging to the well-being of the people of this country. They've been very damaging to our prosperity. And of course, they have caused immense loss of life of our wonderful soldiers and men and women in uniform. The American people get it. Number two, we cannot, under our Constitution, go to war on the basis of a decision by one man. The whole point in our Constitution of vesting war-making authority in the Congress was because our founders saw how kings abused their powers to go to war, how an autocrat abuses his power to unilaterally decide to go to war. A quote from Abraham Lincoln: "The provision of the Constitution," that's our Constitution, giving the war-making powers to Congress, was dictated for the following reasons. Kings had always been involving in impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. And this our convention understood, Lincoln said, to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions. And they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. Yet, in fact, that's exactly what is happening now. One man, Donald Trump, unilaterally decided to start this war. And it's the same person, by the way, who, as candidate Trump, decried, and quite rightly, the rush to war. He decried them, especially wars of regime change, as total failures. He decried the $7 trillion that was spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. So now we have a new situation where the president woke up one day, announced he's going to war, and abandoned his America First commitment. What is clear here is this war is not necessary. Iran, the Ayatollahs, the regime is a threat. We've been containing that threat. There were negotiations about their nuclear capability that were making significant progress. And don't forget that this administration is the one that tore up the agreement in the Obama administration, where we had eyes on exactly what was happening in the Iran nuclear program, and there was compliance. And we substituted with bluster, and now ultimately this war of choice. This is a war that has been pushed hard by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who just before the war started was whispering in the ear of Donald Trump, and it's pretty clear that the president was persuaded by Netanyahu. The president should be more persuaded by the voices of the American people who've learned the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, and even going back to Vietnam. The third reason Americans don't want this war is they want us in this Congress, in this administration, to focus on the needs of Americans. We have a situation in Vermont now, Mr. President, that is similar to what faces people all over this country. With the health care is something that's out of reach for everyday Americans. That is absolutely essential. And you yourself and I and others did our level best to try to extend tax credits so working families and farmers and small businesses who depended on them would be able to continue to have health care. With the One Big Beautiful Bill, 15 million people are losing Medicaid access. What we're seeing is the acceleration of income inequality, where people who work hard, oftentimes 2 jobs, who don't have more time in their life to even work more, at the end of the month can't pay their bills. And isn't it time that we focus on meeting the needs of Americans? Basic things like health care, like affordable housing, like child care, things that make a family secure, things that make a community strong. Mr. President, there is absolutely no coherent rationale that the President has offered for the endgame of this war against Iran. And Mr. President, there is absolutely no explanation from the President about why he has abandoned what he asserted was his long-time opposition to wars of regime change. And Mr. President, and this is the question for all of us in this chamber who serve in the United States Senate and who have responsibilities under the Constitution, specifically Article 1, will this United States Senate allow a single man to plunge this nation into war when it is our constitutional responsibility to make a decision as to whether to send our men and women into combat? That is our responsibility. And vote as all of us will, we cannot avoid our responsibility to vote, to stand and to be counted. Now, at the close, I want to say something that I know every single one of the members of the Senate feels very strongly, and that is support for our men and women in uniform. And Mr. President, we have brave members of the Vermont Guard that are serving right now, and I speak of my concern for them, their well-being, and their families, but I express that same strong sensibility towards every family who has a service member serving in this conflict, and I say that to every service member in the conflict. We support you. But Mr. President, this is a wrong decision. Mr. President, you do not have the right to make this decision unilaterally. And I say to my colleagues in the Congress, we must stand up and do our job and meet our responsibility. And that is why I am a strong supporter of Senator Kaine and Senator Paul's War Powers resolution. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.
Moments ago on the Senate floor, Peter Welch stood and delivered a warning that cut through the chamber with unmistakable urgency. He declared that the president had made the decision, unilaterally, to launch yet another war in the Middle East without consultation with Congress. He called it reckless. He called it detrimental, and he called it a direct threat to the Constitution. But perhaps most striking of all was his assertion that it's pretty clear that the president was persuaded by Netanyahu. That sentence alone carries enormous weight. This was not merely a disagreement over strategy. It was not just partisan criticism. Welch framed the issue as something deeper, a constitutional crisis wrapped in the familiar language of foreign conflict. He invoked Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. He reminded the Senate that Americans have seen this story before. Confident declarations, bold promises, urgent justifications, followed by years of consequences that could not be undone. In Iraq, the claim was weapons of mass destruction. In Afghanistan, the mission expanded and endured for 2 decades. In Libya, regime change fractured a nation and destabilized a region. Welch did not deny that adversaries can be dangerous. He did not deny the complexity of global threats. What he challenged was the pattern, the ease with which a war begins, and the impossibility of predicting where it ends. And then he turned to the Constitution. Article 1 does not vest war-making authority in a single individual. It assigns that power to Congress. The founders understood the temptation of concentrated authority. They had seen monarchs drag nations into conflict under the banner of national interest. Abraham Lincoln's words echoed through Welch's speech, a reminder that the Constitution was designed precisely to prevent one person from bringing the burdens of war upon the people alone. Yet here, Welch argued, that safeguard had been bypassed. The president, he said, simply woke up and declared war. No vote, no authorization, no collective deliberation, a decision of extraordinary consequence made without the body explicitly entrusted with that responsibility. And then came the geopolitical dimension. Welch suggested that this conflict was not born solely of American deliberation, but influenced heavily by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a leader long pressing for confrontation with Iran. According to Welch, it was Netanyahu whispering in the ear of the president before the war began. The implication was clear: foreign persuasion shaping American military action. That allegation carries profound implications for sovereignty and leadership. In the American system, foreign alliances matter, strategic partnerships matter, but ultimate authority, it might be especially over war, is meant to rest with elected representatives accountable to the American people. Welch's argument was that the American people do not want this war. He framed it as a war of choice, not necessity. He pointed out that negotiations over Iran's nuclear program had been progressing. He reminded the chamber that the previous agreement had provided monitoring and compliance mechanisms before it was abandoned. In his view, diplomacy was replaced with escalation. But perhaps the most powerful part of Welch's address was not about Iran at all. It was about Vermont, about healthcare, about working families struggling to pay bills, about 15 million people losing Medicaid access, about rising inequality, about everyday Americans who wake up not thinking about regime change, but about groceries, housing, and stability. His message was that national strength begins at home, that war shifts focus and resources, that Congress has a duty not just to defend the nation abroad, but to secure the well-being of its people within. And at the end, he did something important. He separated the policy from the personnel. He expressed unwavering support for service members. He spoke of Vermont Guard members deployed in this conflict. He made clear that disagreement with the decision is not a lack of support for those who serve. That distinction matters. Because in moments like this, the line between patriotism and policy can blur. Welch's speech sought to sharpen that line. You can honor those in uniform while questioning the wisdom of the mission they've been assigned. So what does this moment reveal? It reveals an ongoing tension at the heart of American democracy: executive power versus legislative authority. It reveals how quickly foreign policy decisions can reshape domestic politics. It reveals how history continues to haunt present choices. And it reveals that the constitutional framework designed centuries ago remains central to today's debates. Will the Senate assert its authority? Will Congress vote, stand, and be counted as Welch demanded? Or will the precedent of unilateral action expand once again? These are not abstract questions. They define the balance of power in the United States. They define who decides when American service members enter combat. They define whether constitutional guardrails hold firm under pressure. War changes nations, but how a nation decides to enter war changes it even more. This moment on the Senate floor was not just a speech. It was a test of leadership, of accountability, of constitutional fidelity. And the outcome will shape not only foreign policy, but the very structure of American governance. If you believe that constitutional authority matters, if you believe that Congress must stand and be counted, if you believe that power should never go unchecked. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA. Support our work to expose the truth. Because in times like these, vigilance is not optional. It is essential.